Welcome to another deep dive. You know I love getting these philosophy entries, and this time we're going to dive into liberalism.
Oh, perfect.
And specifically, we're going to try to unpack this entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that you sent to us.
Sound good.
So, we're not going to go with just simple definitions or anything like that.
Right.
We're going to kind of get into the nuance,
Yeah.
the debates within
The
liberalism.
weeds.
Yeah. Are you ready to kind of taste the different flavors of liberty?
I am. Yeah. Let's do it.
All right. And also think about some of these big questions like whether or not liberalism is really a global ideal. Sounds fun, right?
Yeah.
So one thing that this encyclopedia entry really zeroes in on that's really interesting is that, for liberals, liberty is really seen as the most important political value.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, at the core of liberalism is a commitment to individual liberty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not just about like freedom in a general sense,
Right.
It's more specific than that. And the entry actually highlights this idea called presumption of liberty.
Okay, presumption of liberty. Break that down for me.
Yeah, so imagine like flipping the script. Instead of starting with rules and then kind of granting freedoms, we assume everyone is naturally free.
Okay.
And any restriction on that freedom needs a really good reason to exist.
So you're innocent until proven guilty?
Exactly. It's like innocent until proven guilty, but for freedom. You start with the assumption that people should be free to do what they want,
Okay.
unless there's a compelling reason to restrict that freedom.
So that really sets the stage then, for how liberals approach, government and rights and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of shapes our whole perspective.
Yeah.
So like if we think about, historical milestones like the Magna Carta,
Yeah.
that early fight for individual rights and limited government,
Uh-huh.
it kind of exemplifies that shift, right? It's like a direct challenge to absolute power.
And, I think that's a good point because, you start to think about, we were just talking about, Hobbes before the show.
Right.
And it's interesting because, Hobbes, who's usually associated with, the need for a strong sovereign power,
Right.
he kind of plays an interesting role here too.
Well, yeah. It's kind of funny, right?
Yeah.
Because, like, we think of Hobbes and we think life is nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
But he actually had a big impact on liberal thought.
Interesting.
So even though Hobbes advocated for a strong sovereign, he also believed in the social contract, right?
Okay, yeah.
That governments get their power from the people,
Right. Right.
not the other way around.
Consent of the governed.
Yeah, exactly. So even his, like, all-powerful Leviathan
Mm-hmm.
had a specific job:
Mm-hmm.
maintain peace, not micromanage lives.
Oh, so there are limits even within his system.
Yes. And that limitation on power really paved the way for later liberal thinkers.
So it's like, I guess a seed that was planted there.
Yeah, a seed of limited government, individual autonomy, it's all there.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So we've talked about this presumption of liberty, but this encyclopedia entry goes even deeper, and it talks about how there's three distinct types of liberty: negative, positive, and Republican.
Yes, it's like a freedom sampler platter. You get to try all the different flavors.
Yeah. So why do we care about these distinctions? I mean, does this really matter to like the average person?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it matters a lot.
Okay.
Because, understanding those different flavors can help you figure out what kind of freedom resonates with you most
Okay.
and where you see limitations
Mm.
in, like, our current systems or in the way we think about freedom.
Okay.
So let's start with the most basic one: negative liberty.
Okay.
This is all about freedom from external constraints.
Yeah.
It's like that classic image of, walking down the street without fear,
Okay.
choosing your own career path, expressing your opinions without censorship.
Gotcha. So it's like nobody's actively preventing me from doing something.
Exactly. It's the absence of interference from others.
Okay. So if I'm walking down the street and nobody's like stopping me or harassing me or anything like that, then I'm experiencing that negative liberty.
You got it.
Okay. Makes sense.
Now let's move on to positive liberty, which gets a little bit more complex.
Okay.
This is about, like, having the tools and resources to actually realize your freedom.
Okay.
So it's not just about the absence of external barriers. It's also about having the power to shape your own destiny.
Okay. So even if I'm technically free to do something,
Right.
if I don't have the resources or the means to actually do it, then am I really free?
Yeah. That's the question positive liberty asks us to consider.
Okay. So like if I don't know, like I'm free to go to college, but I can't afford it.
Right.
Then is that, am I really free to go to college?
Exactly. Or like, that classic example of the alcoholic who's legally free to drink, but they might be enslaved by their addiction.
Right, right.
So
Yeah.
positive liberty looks at those kinds of internal and societal factors.
Okay. So it brings in this whole other dimension of like, am I, even if I have that negative liberty, am I really free if I can't, if there are other things kind of preventing me or making it much more difficult to kind of, realize my full potential.
Right. It's like negative liberty, make sure nobody's building walls around you.
Yeah,
But positive liberty is about making sure you have the tools to climb over any walls that might be there.
I like that. Okay, now there's a third type of liberty we haven't even touched on yet, and that's Republican liberty.
Yes.
What's that all about?
So this one's a little bit more historical.
Mm-hmm.
It has its roots in ancient Rome, but it's making a comeback in modern political thought.
Interesting.
And Republican liberty is all about freedom from domination.
Domination. Hmm.
So it's not just about whether someone's actively interfering with you right now.
Okay.
It's about the potential for someone to control you in the future.
Oh, I see. So it's about like, even if I feel free right now,
Right.
what if somebody could easily come in and, take that freedom away?
Exactly. It's about safeguarding against arbitrary power.
Gotcha. So it's about like that potential for abuse.
Yes. Like imagine living under a regime where the laws are unpredictable.
Yeah.
Your rights could be revoked on a whim.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you haven't been directly harmed yet, just the constant threat to your liberty would be a form of domination.
Yeah, so it's about making sure those freedoms are secure, not just today, but tomorrow and the next day.
Exactly. It's about ensuring lasting freedom.
Okay, that's a really interesting concept. So we've got these three types of liberty, and I like how you framed it as like a sampler platter because I'm already kind of feeling like I'm starting to figure out which one of those resonates the most with me.
Right. It helps to kind of break it down.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So now it seems like there's a bit of a family feud within liberalism itself.
Oh, yeah. Always.
You've got like the old liberals versus the new liberals. Tell me about this clash of the titans.
Oh, it's a classic philosophical showdown.
Mm-hmm.
But before we dive into that, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to explore the fascinating world of old versus new liberalism.
It's like we've got this, old guard, protecting their property rights, and then these new like social justice warriors coming in with a different perspective.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. So, classical liberalism, which has its roots in thinkers like John Locke and Adam Smith,
Mm-hmm.
really sees private property as the cornerstone of individual liberty.
Okay.
If you own something, you have the right to use it, to trade it,
Mm-hmm.
even just to keep it without anyone, dictating what you can do.
Right.
And that sense of ownership extends to, the market as a whole.
Okay.
Free markets, where individuals can pursue their economic interests with minimal government intervention.
So it's all about, getting the government out of the way,
Right.
letting individuals make their own choices,
Exactly.
both with their property in the marketplace. Didn't some of these classical liberals really worry about the government kind of controlling too much?
Oh, absolutely. Hayek, a prominent economist, was a big proponent of this view. He argued that government control of resources was a slippery slope toward tyranny.
Okay.
If the government controls the resources, it controls the means of production, communication, even, our basic necessities.
So it's all about limiting, that concentration of power.
Exactly.
All right.
A free market, for Hayek, acted as a safeguard against that.
Okay, so you have the old liberals. They're all about limited government, free markets, protecting property rights. But then we have the new liberals coming in, also known as the social justice liberals. What prompted this shift?
Well, by the early 20th century, it was becoming increasingly clear that the free market wasn't always this perfect utopia that it was, cracked up to be.
Okay.
Thinkers like John Maynard Keynes witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of economic depressions. And they realized that unregulated markets could lead to, widespread suffering,
Right.
instability. So they started asking this question: what good is freedom if you don't have the basic resources to survive, let alone thrive?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you're free to eat cake, but if you can't even afford bread, that freedom doesn't really mean a whole lot.
Right, exactly. So new liberalism emerged from that realization. It argues that true freedom requires more than just those formal rights on paper.
Okay.
It requires a degree of economic and social equality.
Mm.
Thinkers like John Rawls argued that to truly be free, everyone needs a fair shot at success.
Okay. A level playing field.
A level playing field, exactly. And they believe that the government has a role to play in creating that level playing field.
So it's not just about, like, protecting individuals from government overreach. It's also about using government power to make sure everyone has the opportunity to exercise that freedom.
Yeah, to make sure everyone can actually get to the starting line of that race.
Right, right.
Mhm.
Not just a select few. Okay. So while classical liberals are focused on limiting government intervention, the new liberals are a little bit more willing to use government power
Right,
to ensure that everyone has the resources and opportunities they need.
right, to achieve that fairness. And this is where things get really interesting. This idea of government intervention to create a more just and equitable society really didn't sit well with everyone, especially not Robert Nozick.
Ah, yes. Nozick, the defender of individual liberty, against the tyranny of patterned justice.
Exactly. So Nozick argued that any attempt to impose a specific pattern of wealth distribution, no matter how well-intentioned, inevitably infringes on individual liberty.
Okay.
And he used this really famous thought experiment, the Will Chamberlain argument. So imagine we start with a perfectly equal distribution of wealth, okay?
Okay.
But Will Chamberlain, because he's an amazing basketball
Yeah.
player, he attracts these huge crowds who are all willing to pay to see him play. And over time, just because people are freely choosing to give him their money, he becomes much wealthier than everyone else.
Right.
Nozick argues that there's nothing inherently unjust about this outcome,
Okay.
as long as the initial distribution was fair.
So even if we start from a perfectly equal point, individual choices and market forces could naturally lead to these inequalities.
Right.
And for Nozick, trying to correct this through redistribution would be kind of a violation of that individual liberty.
Yeah, it's like trying to force the pieces of a puzzle back into a specific pattern
Yeah.
when they naturally fit together in a different way.
I like that analogy. So we've got this debate between the old and the new liberals. On one hand, you've got the emphasis on individual liberty, limited government. On the other hand, you've got this idea of social justice and, using government power to create a more equitable society. It seems like a really fundamental tension that still exists today.
Absolutely. It really gets to the heart of what it means to be free in a complex world.
Yeah, so can we have both?
That's the million-dollar question.
Can we have robust individual freedom and a fair distribution of wealth?
Right. Do those goals complement each other, or are they fundamentally at odds?
Yeah, it's a question with huge implications for, how we think about taxes and social programs, even, the role of government itself.
It really does touch on everything.
It seems like both old and new liberals, though, are ultimately concerned with ensuring that individual freedom.
Yeah, at the end of the day, that's the common thread.
They just have different ideas about how to best achieve that.
Right, especially in a world where those economic realities can often clash with those ideals of fairness and equality.
Right. Okay, so we've explored those flavors of freedom. We've delved into this family feud between old and new liberalism.
It's been a good debate so far.
But this Stanford Encyclopedia entry takes us even deeper, asking, is liberalism just about politics and economics?
Right.
Or does it have implications for, how we live our lives more broadly, our personal ethics, values, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, is it a blueprint just for governments and laws, or does it offer something more? A philosophy for life? That's where this idea of comprehensive versus political liberalism comes in.
Okay, break that down for me. Comprehensive versus political. What's the distinction there?
Well, it's like asking, how far does the reach of liberalism extend? John Rawls, a prominent figure in new liberalism, argued for what he called political liberalism.
Okay.
This approach recognizes that people in a diverse society are going to hold a wide range of different, what he calls comprehensive doctrines.
Okay.
Their fundamental beliefs about the world, religious views, philosophical perspectives.
So it's acknowledging that we all come from different backgrounds, we have different values, different ideas about what a good life looks like.
Exactly. And Rawls argued that in a society with such diverse views, a liberal framework should provide this neutral space for peaceful coexistence.
Okay.
It's about setting the ground rules for how we interact politically.
Right, right. So, we might disagree on religion or philosophy or, what brings us ultimate happiness, but we can at least agree on some basic principles of fairness, individual rights, how to make decisions together.
Exactly. It's about creating that framework where everyone feels respected, free to pursue their own vision of the good life, as long as they respect the rights of others to do the same.
But doesn't that raise the question, though, can a liberal framework really be completely neutral?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
Or does it inherently favor certain values, even if unintentionally?
Right.
And that's where the discussion of liberal ethics comes in. Even if liberalism tries to be neutral on those big questions of the good life, it can't help but have some underlying ethical principles.
Okay, so what are some of those core values, embedded within liberalism that might shape how we think about our choices, actions, how we live our lives?
Right, well, we've already touched on perfectionism, which emphasizes that self-development, cultivating your talents, becoming the best version of yourself. John Stuart Mill, a champion of individual liberty, was a big proponent of this idea.
That makes sense, right? A philosophy that values individual freedom would also value that individual growth and self-improvement. But isn't there a risk that, perfectionism could lead to a sort of, elitism?
Yeah, it's a good point. Critics of perfectionism often bring that up.
Yeah.
But Mill believed that true perfectionism wasn't about conforming to a single model. It was about each individual discovering and pursuing their own unique potential.
So it's not about, everyone becoming the same, perfect person. It's about having the freedom to find your own path to, growth and fulfillment.
Exactly. And that emphasis on individual autonomy is really central to another ethical thread within liberalism,
Mm,
contractualism.
okay.
This idea suggests that morality, and by extension, like liberal principles, arise from agreements between rational individuals.
Okay, so it's like we're all signing a social contract,
Yeah.
agreeing to certain limitations on our freedom in exchange for the benefits of living in a stable and just society.
Exactly. But even within contractualism, you have different flavors.
Oh, okay.
There's the Kantian version, inspired by Immanuel Kant,
Mhm.
which focuses on finding those universal moral principles that everyone could rationally agree to.
Okay, so it's about finding that common ground based on reason.
Right, regardless of our individual desires or goals.
Gotcha.
But then you have the Hobbesian version of contractualism, named after Thomas Hobbes.
Right.
And this view sees morality arising more from self-interest. Individuals recognizing the chaos and danger of a world without rules, they agree to that social contract to protect themselves.
So it's less about this grand moral code. It's more about a pragmatic agreement to create a system that benefits everyone.
Exactly. It's like, look, we might not all be angels,
Right.
but we can at least agree on some rules to keep things from getting too crazy.
Yeah, to prevent that chaos. Okay, that makes sense. So these different versions of contractualism, it seems like they feed into this broader debate within liberalism about the foundations of morality and justice.
Yeah, is it based on this inherent sense of right and wrong? Or is it ultimately about creating a system that just works?
Right, right, a pragmatic approach.
And that leads us to another really interesting area, theories of value.
Okay.
Liberalism, with its focus on individual choice, has to grapple with that question of, what makes a life good?
So it's not just about giving people freedom, it's also about understanding what they might do with that freedom.
Exactly. So what are some of those different ways liberals have tried to define the good life?
Right, especially in a society where individuals are free to pursue their own paths.
Right. So we've already talked about perfectionism, which sees self-development as central, but there's also pluralism, which emphasizes the diversity of values.
Okay.
The idea that there are many different paths to a good life.
Pluralism seems to really fit well with that liberal emphasis on individual choice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like saying, hey, there's no single right way to live.
Right.
What matters is that you find something meaningful
Yeah.
and you pursue it freely as long as you respect others' rights to do the same.
So it's about embracing that diversity of values.
Right. Recognizing that what fulfills one person might be totally different for another.
Right.
And this connects to another liberal theory of value, subjectivism.
Hmm.
This idea argues that values are ultimately based on individual preferences and desires.
So beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Or in this case, value is in the eye of the valuer.
Got it.
But doesn't that lead to this sort of moral relativism?
That's a common critique for sure. But liberals who endorse this view often argue that even if there are no objective, universal values, that doesn't mean we can't have a shared morality or a just society. Through open dialogue, empathy, a commitment to finding common ground, We can create a world where individuals are free to pursue their own visions of the good life,
Yeah.
while still respecting those rights and freedoms of others.
Okay, so even in a world of diverse values, we can still find a way to live together
Yeah.
peacefully and productively.
Right. Finding that balance is key.
Okay. So we've gone pretty deep here. We've unpacked these different types of liberty. We've explored this debate between old and new liberalism.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We've even delved into these kind of the ethical implications of liberal thought. But this Stanford Encyclopedia entry takes us one step further.
It does.
It asks, how far does the reach of liberalism really extend?
Right.
Is this a universal ideal
The million-dollar question.
meant for all people in all places, or are there limits?
Yeah, it's a question that's been debated within liberalism since its very beginnings. And it takes us from those individual rights and domestic policies to that global stage.
It's a big shift in perspective.
It is. It forces us to consider those obligations to those beyond our borders and how to navigate a world where not everyone embraces those liberal values.
Right, because it's not like everyone agrees with this stuff.
Not at all. So, are you ready to tackle that global dilemma?
Let's do it. I'm ready. Let's see what this encyclopedia entry has to say about the scope and reach of liberalism on that global stage. So it's like we've been, exploring this like inner world of liberalism, its DNA, its family dynamics.
Yeah.
And now we're kind of zooming out to see, like, where does it fit in the grand scheme of things?
Right. We're going global.
Yeah, taking that global perspective. And, as you said, it brings its own set of challenges.
Well, absolutely. A whole new set of
Yeah,
complexities.
and the Stanford Encyclopedia kind of points to John Stuart Mill, his writings on barbarism,
Yeah.
as an example of how, like, even a staunch advocate for individual liberty
Right.
kind of wrestled with this question of whether, liberal principles,
Right.
are they really universal?
Yeah. Are they meant for everyone, everywhere?
And, Mill, he had some pretty controversial views on this.
Oh, he did. He did.
Yeah.
He basically said that some societies just aren't ready for freedom,
Right.
especially those he considered less civilized.
It's kind of jarring to read that kind of language,
Yeah.
coming from someone we associate with, freedom and equality.
I know. It's definitely a product of his time,
Right.
that colonial mindset. But it does raise a question that's still relevant today, I think.
Okay.
Like, does liberalism require a certain level of development,
Okay.
certain cultural preconditions to really work?
Yeah. I mean, can you just transplant it to any society?
Yeah, that's the question. Regardless of its history, its traditions, its values.
Right. And that's a question that has very real implications today, for how we interact with other nations.
Right. Especially those with different political systems or cultural norms.
Right. Like, should we be, promoting liberal values?
Right. Is it our responsibility to spread the word of freedom?
Yeah. Even if it means, intervening in other countries' affairs.
Right. Or should we just mind our own business?
Right. Respect the sovereignty of other nations, even if we don't agree with what's going on there.
Exactly. And that's the tension between, like, state-centered liberalism and cosmopolitanism.
Okay. Explain that to me. State-centered versus cosmopolitan.
So state-centered liberalism basically sees the nation-state as the main unit of political organization.
Okay.
And it focuses on protecting individual rights and freedoms within those boundaries.
Okay.
Cosmopolitanism, on the other hand, takes a more global view.
Okay.
It argues that principles like, human rights, individual autonomy, they should extend to all people.
Okay, so it's like, our moral obligations, do they stop at our borders or do they extend to all of humanity?
That's the question. Do we prioritize the well-being of our own citizens, above the rights of those in other countries? It's a tough one. It is. And the encyclopedia explores how even thinkers within the liberal tradition, they've struggled with this.
Okay.
Like John Rawls, in his later work, he tried to kind of reconcile these perspectives.
No, interesting.
He developed a law of peoples, which was basically a set of principles for how liberal societies should interact with other societies.
Okay, so like rules of engagement for a global community.
Yeah, even for those societies that don't necessarily share those liberal values.
Right. Not everyone's playing by the same rule book. That sounds like really challenging.
Oh, it is. It is. And it gets even more challenging when you think about how to deal with illiberal groups within liberal societies.
Okay, so like what happens when, someone's cultural practices or their religious beliefs clash with liberal
Right,
values?
like individual autonomy, gender equality, things like that. How do we balance that respect for diversity with the need to protect those fundamental rights?
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act.
It is.
It reminds me of that Amish schooling case that's mentioned in the encyclopedia,
Oh, right. Yeah.
where, these Amish families, they wanted to exempt their children from compulsory education laws
Right.
because they felt like it violated their beliefs.
Right. Their religious beliefs, their way of life.
And it's like a perfect example of how like these ideas that we've been talking about in the abstract,
Yeah.
they really get tested when you put them into these real world
Right.
situations.
It's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah. And it forces us to ask some really hard questions.
Like, how much tolerance is enough?
Yeah.
Where do we draw the line between, respecting difference and protecting those individual rights?
And are there some things that a liberal society just can't accommodate?
Yeah. Without compromising its own core values.
Wow. So after this deep dive, it's clear that liberalism is so much more than just a set of political beliefs. I mean,
Yeah.
it's this rich and complex tradition, and it's constantly evolving,
Right.
grappling with new challenges, both, here at home, but also on that global stage.
And it's a tradition that's all about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Between individual freedom and that common good,
Yeah.
between these universal principles
Yeah.
and the complexities of a diverse world.
Yeah, it's a conversation that really requires our active participation.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in shaping what liberalism means in the 21st century.
So, as you're listening to this, as you're going about your day, think about it. What does liberalism mean to you? What version of liberty really resonates with your
Right.
values?
What flavor of freedom speaks to you?
Where do you see the limits of the liberal ideal,
And how can we all work together to create a more just and free world?
both for ourselves and for others?
It's a journey, not a destination.
Keep those questions in mind and keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration of liberalism.
See you next time.